13 years ago, a jury deliberated for just 2 hours before finding John Wayne Gacy guilty of murdering 33 young men and boys.
Serial killer John Wayne Gacy, nicknamed the Killer Clown, killed as many as 33 young men and boys and buried many of them in the crawl space at his suburban Chicago home.
Egan described Gacy as rational, premeditated, and evil, who killed his victims like flies when they got in his way.
I have a lot of things that I've forgotten that I can't remember. For instance, I can go back to my childhood and stuff and I still remember that, but yet I can go into the 70s and there are a lot of things I can't remember. The same thing with the victims. I've looked at all of, I don't know if you notice here, we got pictures of every one of the victims here. And believe it or not, for the last 12 years, I've studied these photos of these victims. And there is no, we have a shot of all of the victims together here. And when you look over at the photos, I have no recollection of any of them. Never met them.
In December 1978, thousands of people from around the world would turn their televisions on to witness one of the world's most gruesome discoveries. When investigators discovered 29 bodies, all teenage boys buried beneath the house. An emotional time for some and a terrifying time for others, as loved ones would finally find their lost family member. This is the heinous story of John Wayne Gacy. On March 17, 1942, Chicago, Illinois, a boy would be conceived by the name of John Gacy. Growing up, John would experience a troubled childhood. While his father was a raging alcoholic who constantly mistreated him, he was called John the Sissy and would be beaten on numerous occasions. Although he had a horrible relationship with his father, John would develop a great relationship with his mother and sisters. When John was 11 years old, he was struck on the head with a swing, resulting in a blood clot forming in his brain. It was unnoticed until he turned 16. Where John began to experience frequent blackouts. John would be further isolated at school, unable to play with other children due to a congenital heart defect and the frequent blackouts. His father punished John by forbidding social interactions for his flaws. It was then John would struggle with his sexuality, learning he was attracted to the opposite sex. During his adolescence, John would drop out of 4 different high schools before completing his senior year. He would then move west with his family and worked in Las Vegas in the medical field. He would return to Chicago and enroll in the Northwestern Business College during the early 60s. He would soon develop a passion for salesmanship, as he was a natural salesman who can charm his way into and out of almost any situation. John went to work as a management trainee at a shoe company in downtown Chicago shortly after graduating. He did so well, John was relocated to Springfield with the sole responsibility of overseeing the company. In 1966, John would take over the family's chicken business at the request of his father-in-law. According to documentation, John led a good and bright life. However, his status as a well-known and well-liked member of the community would take a dark turn. In 1968, just 2 years after gaining a reputable reputation, John was apprehended for the first time. He was accused of persuading a young male into having sexual activities. John pleaded guilty to sodomy and received a 10-year term in Iowa State Men's Reformatory, located in Hermosa. Following his incarceration, John's first wife, Marilyn Myers, would eventually file for divorce, making John enraged. John began making threats stating he didn't want to see his children anymore, and that he wished Marilyn, along with the 2 kids, were dead. In 1970, after serving 18 months in prison, John would be released despite the disapproval of the jail psychiatrist. According to records, the psychiatrist reviewing his cognitive skills described John as a psychopath and a sexual sadist. He stated John would be a danger to society for the rest of his life. Despite this, he was allowed to return to Chicago and resume his normal life. There, He began his own construction company shortly after working as a building contractor. During that year, he remarried a recently divorced woman he met through a mutual friend. The two would move in together in Des Plaines, Cook County. That same year, John would be arrested for the second time. In February 1971, John was accused of attempting to rape a young man. When the victim failed to appear in court for the hearing, the charges were dismissed. John had a knack for running businesses. Local merchants would describe him as a savvy businessman who would frequently undercut his business rivals by recruiting high school teenagers to minimize the cost. An active participant in his community, becoming involved in the local Democratic Party. There, he would have his photo taken with the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter, an activist and an advocate for mental health. In March 1976, John's second wife would soon divorce him. She felt she could no longer live with the marriage due to her husband's unpredictable moods and his homosexual tendencies. It was then John began to spend his time throwing elaborate street parties for friends and neighbors. He even dressed up as a clown and would entertain kids at a nearby hospital. He enjoyed entertaining little children and young adults, which ultimately fueled his passion. Soon after, he frequently would refer to his alter ego as Pogo the Clown. On December 12, 1978, a teenager by the name of Robert Peist would mysteriously vanish. When police were notified that John was the last person to be seen with Roberts, police would then refocus their attention. After a quick background check, investigators were astonished to find that John had previously served time for sodomy on a juvenile boy. Police would submit a search warrant which would be approved shortly after. When investigators arrived at 8215 West Summerdale, nothing seemed out of the ordinary until investigators accessed a crawl space leading beneath the home. It didn't take long for the putrid odor to mask the area. A collection of decaying bodies, all young men, were found jammed underneath John's house. During the investigation, police discovered one of the rings that belonged to another adolescent who had vanished a year prior. It was then police would grasp the severity of the situation with this gruesome discovery. Though the victims would later be identified years after, investigators would continuously discover disturbing evidences linking to many other disappearances. John would eventually confess to authorities on December 22, 1974. He was aware that his dark secrets were about to be revealed.
He confessed to almost everything. You have all the bodies, Gacy said, and there was even a killer map showing where 27 youths were buried. And in fact, he led police to his garage and sprayed orange paint on the concrete to mark the spot precisely where a body was found. And then there's the Gacy confession about how he killed his victims. Strangled them with his now infamous rope trick that police say he demonstrated to them with a rosary bead. He says he was simply discussing knots in general. Catch his sense of humor.
Shoelaces, huh? You're in trouble now.
Yeah, right.
Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I says, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot. He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. This is hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it. And I said, then you put a second knot in it. Okay? Mm-hmm. I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here, and you just turn this. And I says, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
He confessed to the murder of 33 young men during the previous 7 years. He also gave investigators an elaborate description of the 28 shallow graves he dug beneath his house. In February 6, 1980, over 100 witnesses were called to testify throughout the 5-week trial. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours after the closing arguments before finding Gacy guilty on 33 counts of murder. John would spend almost a decade and a half in prison at the correctional facility in Illinois. After appealing his conviction and giving contradicting explanations about the murder in the interviews, John referred to the 1970s as his cruising years because it was one of the times that he committed most of his murders. Despite his confession in an attempt to seek mercy, he would later be denied each and every time. On May 9, 1994, 14 years after his conviction, John would eat his last meal: fried chicken, french fries, a Coke, and a strawberry shortcake. The next day, he was executed during midnight. His last words: "Kiss my ass," before he died by lethal injection. Special thanks to my Patreon and channel members. Happy Halloween.